Welcome to my video. I'd like to show you how to graft two pieces of say a shawl together. Now if you can imagine, there's a garter stitch edge left and right. I've got 4 stitches left and right which are in garter stitch. Then the main shawl body is represented by these 8 stocking stitch stitches in the middle. At the top I have the same thing, and if you can imagine, that would be the shawl border, and you want to graft them together. I have a blunt pointed tapestry needle or wool sewing needle. It has a large eye and a rounded end, and I've already cut my yarn to a length which is at least four times the width of the piece that I'm grafting, and just a little bit more. I'll thread the tapestry needle with the wool, and now the technique that I'm going to use is called Kitchener Plus, which is Kitchener stitch, and I'm going to work the opposite for the garter stitch edge than I would for the normal stocking stitch piece. Now I've made another YouTube video showing you how to graft stocking stitch, and so if you'd like to watch that first you can, otherwise you can just follow the instructions here if you also have a piece such as this. So these garter stitch edges, the first 4 stitches, when I hold the 2 pieces together like so, as they're going to be grafted, they have purl bumps here on the front needle, and the garter stitch edge are knit stitches on the back needle. Garter stitch is grafted in exactly the opposite way as you would normal stocking stitch. So if you have a purl stitch facing you, you first have to lock the stitches on the end stitches, before you can slip them off. Normally you would lock a purl stitch knitwise. This time you slip in as if to purl and lock this end stitch purlwise and pull the yarn tight. Then you go to the back needle. It's a knit stitch which would normally be locked purlwise, but because it's the garter stitch edge you lock it knitwise. Now that these end stitches have been locked, you treat the stitches in pairs, and for garter stitch you would slip the first stitch knitwise on the front needle and off the needle, and you would lock the next stitch as if to purl. On the back needle you slip the first stitch as if to purl, so pull the wool through and off the needle, and lock the next stitch as if to knit, so you slip the needle in knitwise and pull the yarn through. Now the next 2 pairs of stitches are treated in the same way. You slip the front stitch knitwise off the needle and lock it purlwise. You slip the back stitch purlwise, so into the stitch as if to purl, and off the needles, and lock the next stitch knitwise. Repeat it again. Slip knitwise, off the needles, lock purlwise, slip purlwise, lock knitwise. Now that finishes the treatment of the garter stitch edge, and as you can see, there's the row of purl bumps, there's a knit row, and there's the next row of purl bumps, so that's grafted correctly. Now you have one remaining stitch of the garter stitch edge before the stocking stitch stitches start, and that means that you treat the two stitches in opposing ways, so you can just follow the instructions if you want. The purl stitch has been locked, so it's slipped. Normally it would be slipped purlwise, but because it's the garter stitch edge, you slip it knitwise and off the needles. Now you're however faced with a stitch in stocking stitch, and in order to lock a knit stitch you do that purlwise. So from this point on the instructions flip around to exactly the opposite of what they were for the garter stitch edge. So a knit stitch would normally be slipped knitwise, but for the garter stitch edge it's slipped purlwise and off the needles. But now you have a purl stitch which is in the stocking stitch part of the work, and so that is locked knitwise. It might become easier when you get to the instructions for the last 4 stitches. Now follow the instructions for grafting Kitchener stitch when you're grafting 2 stocking stitch pieces together. You slip as if to knit and off the needles, and you lock as if to purl. On the back needle you slip as if to purl, so go into the stitch purlwise and off the needles, and then you lock the stitch knitwise and pull it through. Slip knitwise, lock purlwise, slip purlwise on the back needle and lock knitwise on the back needle, and then adjust the tension. Slip knitwise, lock purlwise, slip purlwise on the back needle, lock knitwise. I've come to the point where I have the last stitch of the stocking stitch body, and then I have the 4 garter stitch edge stitches on both the front and back needles. For the stocking stitch that's knitted off, so go in as if to knit and slip it off, but then instead of locking the purl stitch knitwise I lock it purlwise. Then the purl stitch on the back needle is slipped off as if to purl, and then I have a garter stitch knit stitch facing me, which would normally be locked purlwise if it was stocking stitch, but as it's garter stitch I lock it as if to knit. Now let's adjust the tension, and now I keep going. These are garter stitch stitches. The purl stitch is slipped off knitwise and locked purlwise, and on the back I slip it purlwise, lock it knitwise. Again, slip knitwise, lock purlwise, slip purlwise, lock knitwise. Pull tight. Slip knitwise, lock purlwise, slip purlwise, lock knitwise. Now these last 2 stitches have been locked, and so they can just be slipped. I slip the front stitch knitwise off the needles and the back stitch purlwise, stitch on the back needles purlwise. Apart from adjusting the tension slightly, you can see a perfectly grafted garter stitch border, stocking stitch main and garter stitch border. And that's how to graft a shawl which has garter stitch edges. I hope that helps, and if you did want to read up the instructions that I follow, these are from Reversible Knitting by Lynn Barr on pages 183 and 184. See you again.